Welcome to General ASE Practice Test 6. We're going to give you another run at these things and see how you do this. Some of these are from my personal experience rather than being some kind of a generic question, but I tried to make them sort of like the ASE people do, where they'll sort of match just about any car, you know.
See that? That's an irregular misfire.
That's a random idle misfire, but it clears up above idle. Is that caused by a close plug gap, a skewed IAT, a weak coil output, or a low fuel level? It's kind of funny. One morning my wife heard an engine start up somewhere in the neighborhood, and she said, "What's that?" And I said, "Let's see, that's a 2004 Dodge with a 3.7, and I hear a random idle miss on cylinder number 3. She said, "You can't tell all that." And I said, "Of course I can. I just hear an engine starting up just like you do, you know." It was really kind of funny. I could come up with all that stuff. I used to do that with my boys all the time, talking about how when a truck drove by, I'd say, "Well, that engine's running a little bit rich. I can smell it from here, you know." Question 2, what results from a slightly stuck open EGR valve? You get road speed surge, high intake temp, cruise detonation, or lean O2 readings. Question 3, what condition creates a high short-term fuel trim at cold idle only with normal long-term fuel trim? And this is normal all the rest of the time too. The only time you're getting is short-term fuel trim at idle goes up, but then it levels off very soon as the engine warms up. What causes the O2 sensors to consistently read max lean on one bank and max rich on the other bank? Is this cross plug wires, aging sensor cells, aftermarket mass airflow, or connector issues? Question 5, what can cause low engine vacuum at idle on a distributorless ignition engine? Advanced valve timing, harmonic balancer loose, burned exhaust valve seat, or EGR passages clogged up? Question 6. What causes a hard start long crank with the engine cranking at normal speed if the engine otherwise turns well? Would this be a weak E-core coil spark, dust and evaporative canister, excessive fuel pressure, or high crank sensor voltage? Question 7. One headlight is dim even after the bulb has been replaced. What do we do now? Do we look for a leaky lamp housing, maybe a weak charging system, park lamp relay burned, or do we do a voltage drop test? A new blower motor runs at all speeds but produces very little airflow on a vehicle with no cabin air filter. Do we have clogged condenser fins, jammed blend doors, bad recirc door motor, or faulty blower motor? Question 9. What can cause a hard start condition after refueling? Dirty throttle body, canister purge valve, open IAT sensor, or leaking injector tip? Question 10. What usually causes a variable valve timing system to set over retard, PO112 or PO14 codes, over retard or over advance, there's two different codes. When you use the wrong oil filter, shorted cam position sensor, worn phaser lock pin, or sludged oil passages? All right, now here are our answers. Random idle misfire that clears up above idle will be close plug gap. That was something that I've started, I learned that way back in 1978 or 9. First time I had actually ever noticed it. The lady came to me and said that her engine was misfiring. And I don't remember that. Maybe I had fixed another car for that same kind of problem, pulled it out, and the plug wires weren't gapped. The plugs weren't gapped right. They were gapped too close, and I gapped the plugs right, and I went away. And then every time after that I heard that, this when this idle that you saw earlier that I demonstrated with a rag, where it's sitting there idling smooth and going poo, 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 poo. You know, that's basically a random misfire due to a close plug gap. Now, it can be fouled for other problems. The plug can and cause a similar deal. But especially if somebody has just replaced the spark plugs, and that typically means that you need to make sure that they're gapped right. There was a van, you know, these 5-liter vans. Whenever I would put new plugs in one of these old pushrod V8s, I would always gap them just a little wider than the specs called for. You know, I think the specs call for 42 to 46. If you put it on 42, you're going to have a misfire. Well, this buddy of mine that had been working at Lincoln Mercury for years came down there, and he was doing a tune-up in a van. And I said, you better gap those spark plugs out to about 50. He says, no, this thing says 42 to 46, and I'm gapping them like this thing says. I'm not listening to you. I said, okay, you're going to have issues when you put it back, when you fire it up. He fired it up. He had a random idle miss, boo, 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 because he had gapped them down around 43 or something like that. And he had to pull them all back out and re-gap them, and then he ate a little crow. But the thing about it is, if you gap them a little closer, then, and you're somebody that's wanting to do, you know, racing at the track or something like that, a closer gap on the plugs will make it less likely to cut out at extreme high RPM. But it won't idle good. So that's the point. If you gap them wide and you're, you know, tacking up about 8,000 RPM or whatever, it's going to start cutting out because of the, you know, you'll get actually more spark duration if you gap them close than you will if you gap them farther apart, because whatever goes up doesn't go this way. You know, if the spark line is high, the duration gets shorter. That's just the way that works. What results from a slightly stuck open EGR valve? You're going to have high intake temperature. If you fire one up that's idling rough, and you lay your hand on the upper intake manifold and you feel it starting to get hot real fast, you got EGR flowing. Helped a friend of mine that had a tire store, and he said they had to put an intake gasket on one, and somebody had disconnected the EGR valves. You know, it's one of these electric ones here. They had disconnected the EGR valve so it wouldn't even work, because something that was electrically holding it open. I don't know what was going on with that one, other than the fact that I knew. I said, you got EGR flow. And he says, well, the EGR valve was disconnected when we took it apart, but we put it back together the way it was supposed to be. And so when you disconnected the EGR valve, the idle smoothed out, upper intake cooled off. So that's how you tell that's what's going on. It will also cause low engine vacuum if EGR is flowing at idle. What condition creates high short fuel trim at cold idle only with normal long fuel trim? I used to see this on the ones that had these silicone rubber gaskets, and that little lip would be damaged to the point where it would let air leak in there when the engine was cold, and because the oxygen sensor's got those heaters in them, they come online within 60 seconds of you starting it up. And if you looked at your fuel trim, you'd see plus 20 or something short fuel trim at cold idle, but almost immediately it would start to taper off and everything would be normal. You know, your long fuel trim would be normal, your short fuel trim would be normal. And so that would be intake gasket issues that would you have there. You could basically troubleshoot that by watching that fuel trim while you use your carburetor spray just to mist a little bit of the base of the intake, of the upper intake, if you can get to it with those gaskets. Now the other kind of gaskets won't typically do that, the old cut gaskets, but these silicone rubber ones are prone to do that kind of thing. What causes O2 sensors to consistently read max lean on one bank and max rich on the other? I've actually seen this on one that I was working on, where somebody had plugged the two oxygen sensors in backwards because the connectors were swinging right there next to each other on that one. Seems to me like way back then that was a Thunderbird, like a 88 Thunderbird or something like that, back when they were nearly new. Somebody else had worked on it. But anyway, it turns out that the newer ones know this is a problem, and they'll actually throw you a code. Whenever they see this kind of thing happening, and the algorithms in the computer will reason it out, and they'll throw you a code saying, hey, you need to check and see if these sensors are crossed. All right, harmonic balancer loose, believe it or not. If you got one of those balancers, you know, like on some of your, if this tone wheel is built onto the balancer, and the balancer is not one of those that you have to pull off with a puller, but you can just pull it off with your fingers, you know, and there are some out there like Toyota 2.2 and some of your older Escorts were like that. If somebody doesn't tighten that bolt enough, or if it, you know, works its way loose because they just didn't torque it when they put it on there, like some do-it-yourself guy at home, and it starts rocking this heavy balancer back and forth, it'll wallow out that pin, and it can make the timing slow because it has re-indexed this wheel. And the crankshaft will be running ahead of this. Now, the crazy thing about these kind of deals is I've had them come in there and they'd say it runs just fine, and then all of a sudden it won't hardly go, and then it runs just fine again, and I don't really know what's going on here. And I would raise it up, pull the wheel, and you grab a hold of that balancer, and you could just rock it back and forth because it had wallowed out the pin. Sometimes it would mess up the crankshaft and the keyway where it goes in the crankshaft and all that. And in those cases, rather than selling them a whole crankshaft, I would just go ahead and put it on there and make sure it was indexed really, close as it could. Just tighten the crap out of the balancer bolt. Usually they didn't have any trouble with it after that. Of course, if they did have trouble, they need a crankshaft. They need to be told that up front, This won't typically happen on the ones where you really, where you have to pull the balancer off with a puller. However, on those, if you don't tighten the balancer enough, it won't pinch that bottom timing gear, the timing gear against that goes against the boss on the crankshaft. And if the keyway is all that's holding that timing gear, then the pressure of the crankshaft having to turn the camshafts and all can actually shear the key and cause the crankshafts to start running ahead of the gear. And I've got a picture of that where we had one that was doing that, and you'll have low engine vacuum because of that too. But anyway, what causes the hard start long crank with the engine cranking at normal speed if the engine otherwise spins well? I worked on a Taurus one time, excuse me, and it had a hard start. It would just spin and spin and spin and spin and spin. And I checked it, and the coil, it was an E-core coil. It was only capable of putting out about 48,000 volts, which it should have been able to put out about twice that. And to start with, I just sort of discounted that because you had spark and everything. But I wasn't too happy with the amount of voltage that thing was producing, but I kept looking in other places for the problem. Finally, I put another coil on it that had a really hot, scary, inch-long blue lightning spark, and it fired right up. And so you can basically start thinking of it like that. The old textbooks and even some of the shop manuals would say when you were checking spark, and they were talking about back in the days when there were points, and those little oil-filled coils typically wouldn't produce over, with points, they wouldn't produce over about 50,000 volts anyway. Newer ones, the E-core coils, and all produce up to 110,000 volts or something like that. The HEI ignition on GM came out in the mid-70s, was popping 80, 90,000 volts. Anyway, if you, they'd say, check and see if the spark jumps 1/4 of an inch. If it does, you need to look somewhere else for your problem. And I'd seen quite a few pretty good mechanics that were still using that same rule. I like to stretch that spark until it's downright scary. If I start stretching it, and after it hits about 3/4 of an inch, it's already turned yellow or it's gone away, and that coil is too weak, and that's typically a coil just about every time. One headlight is dim even after the bulb has been replaced. What now? Well, we need to do a voltage drop test on the power and ground sides of that circuit that's feeding that dim headlight. And this is what it looks like. Let's get rid of all these words, except for the ones that are pertinent. All right, we're going to put our meter here. We're going to go from the positive side of the battery, and we're going to back probe the positive side of the bulb. The lights have got to be on when you do this now. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the negative side. Now, you notice in our example here, we're dropping 3.32 volts between the hot side of the battery and the hot side of the bulb, and we're basically dropping only 0.8 on the ground side of the bulb, so obviously the problem is on the positive side. Now what you got to do then is you got to take your meter and you have to vector in, leave it here, and then move this red one like here, and then you're going to go up, and, you know, follow it up here. And of course, if it was up here, it would be both lights, but you're typically going to have a problem on here. Now, if you've got a problem here, your low beam headlight's going to be dim too. So there is that, you know. But that's how I taught my students to do that. Go from the headlight all the way to the battery, and you're checking everything in between. And then you got to vector in on exactly where the problem is. Usually on a headlight, it'll have the, you know, scorched terminal connectors or whatever, and you can just unplug the light and say, oh gosh, that's terrible, it's oxidized and everything, you know. Question number 8, a new blower motor runs at all speeds. Blower motor here is the one that came out of the car. Which way is it turning? Let go of it, Joe.
All right, let's go in that way. Now hook this new one up. It's made in China. Wonderful. I don't care if it does have the VDO name on it. Now, let go. All right, now notice that it's turning the opposite direction. It's turning this way. Do it again. Okay. Now that will make the car not have any air hardly at all coming out of the blower, and so we got to replace the blower motor on this one again with one hopefully that's wired up right this time.
What the deal was on that, they put the permanent magnets in the motor housing backwards, you know, because they got norths and souths, and if you put them in there backwards, when you fire it up, the motor's going to spin backwards. And that was a brand new motor from the parts store, which I thought that was pretty funny. And you don't expect that. Now, one of the bugs I used to plant on some of the older cars that I had was I would unkey the blower the wires out of the blower motor connector and transpose them, plug it back in, and let it run backwards. I say, hey, we don't have any air coming out of here. Boy, they would just go crazy trying to figure that one out. You don't often see this, but it's a good idea to know that if the blower is noisy and you don't have a cabin air filter, there's nothing to slow the blow down. I mean, you know, the blower motor down as far as the airflow. And you need to make sure that the blower is spinning in the right direction, and that's what we did here. If you have a bad canister purge valve, when you gas up, when this thing is gassing up, it can push vapor all the way through here, all the way through there, into the intake manifold. And you got that real heavy cloud of vapor intake manifold. You go to spin it over, it all of a sudden condenses and it goes in there and wets the spark plugs, and until they dry off, you know, it's really hard to start. If it's bad enough, sometimes it won't start at all. But usually it's just a hard start, or it may be a stumble when you pull away from the pump or something like that. Basically, if somebody has packed the tank, there's always supposed to be an airspace in the tank. And that's why when you fill it up, it's got that little hose inside of a hose on the filler top pipe. But you know that airspace is actually supposed to be there so that it can have expansion, contraction room and all that, instead of having it crammed all the way full. I have had people that would rock the vehicle and keep packing gas in there just to see how much gas they could get in, and that's never a good idea. Or if you keep packing enough gas in it and saturating the canister, it causes other problems too. And this is just the most common cause for this kind of thing is sludged oil passages. You know, and if somebody's in a lot of short trips or mom and pop stuff and all that, and it goes ahead and does the clogs up the screen, you know, little holes or whatever that feed this, and it's going to cause these cam phasers not to work right. They either can't return to where they're supposed to be or they can't move, and that's basically going to be your answer to your question 10. And I created that little illustration there for you that's more or less accurate. Sludged oil passages, you know, that's an important thing to look into. Well, that's the end of our test. We've been here a little less than 20 minutes. I hope you guys are enjoying these tests. I have a great deal of fun putting them together. I noticed, though, they don't have as many views as some of my other videos. But if you're looking to, there's one guy sent me a message and asked me about, you know, what kind of study guides I would recommend and all that. There's a lot of people that have watched these videos that I make, and they've told me that because they watched these videos, they passed their ASE test that they had previously failed. And I don't know if they've all had that experience, but it's gratifying to know that you helped somebody a little bit. Anyway, you guys, let me know what you think about this, and I'll see you next week.